I'm always intrigued by stories of humans who end up in extreme situations and how they manage to get through those situations and the effects that it has on them going forward. And so that's one reason why, even though I'm mostly pacifistic in terms of my outlook towards war and that sort of thing, I do really enjoy reading stories that are written by soldiers or those who have participated in combat, because it's just such an insane environment, and the effects that it has are so profound. So a few of the most recent books I've picked up are one by Michael Stevenson called The Last Full Measure: How Soldiers Die in Battle. And it's an exploration of soldiers going all the way back to the ancient Greeks, right up to modern times, and how they handled, I guess, being around death and dying. And then there's another one that sticks with an older setting. It's Waterloo Voices 1815, The Battle at First Hand, which is a bunch of first-hand accounts, obviously, by soldiers who were at the Battle of Waterloo. There's a book and that one's by Martin Beardsley. This one by Anthony Lloyd is called My War Gone By, I Miss It So. And it is more an examination of the impacts on this author, who is a war correspondent, of his experiences observing the war and chronicling it, and basically dealing with the PTSD that resulted, and trying to get back to a normal life after those experiences and how the PTSD impacted him. So that looked interesting, because the PTSD I have, it's complex PTSD, and one of the main components of that is the PTSD I have from my 16 years of paramedic work, and that aligns basically with the type of PTSD that soldiers get from combat in terms of dealing with humans who are in pieces and dead and dying, and being actually responsible for people's lives and all of that sort of thing. The PTSD I have very much corresponds with the PTSD that veterans experience. So it was a book that interested me, though I wasn't feeling mentally quite prepared to dive into that one. So the one I ended up reading is a book by Kevin Seitz called The Things They Cannot Say. What I didn't realize was this book is very much a parallel to the one I was just talking about, My War Gone By, I Miss It So, in that this is written by a war correspondent who ended up with PTSD from his experiences. And in The Things They Cannot Say, he interviews a whole bunch of different soldiers about their experiences in war, and each one of them ends up with PTSD, and he talks about how that has affected their lives and where they are today in comparison to what they were before the experiences in combat there. Although at least one of the subjects of his book ended up dying from the PTSD, and PTSD is commonly a deadly illness. That's really kind of a part of it that I don't know if everybody realizes. So what I accidentally ended up reading was a book about PTSD. Let me talk about how that affected me. So yeah, I wasn't quite prepared to take a deep dive into PTSD issues, but I just kind of rolled with it and decided to see how the experience of these people compared to my own. And I ended up finding a lot of things that kind of stuck out to me as I read through the book. I don't think I want to go deep into my own PTSD in this particular video. Rather, I'll just kind of read some of the things that stuck out to me, and maybe not necessarily expound too much on why they stuck out to me. First of all, right from the introduction, the author acknowledges the importance of talking about this stuff to the people who are experiencing it. So there's a quote in the introduction that says, quote, "A large part of treating PTSD is simply getting the veteran to remember and talk about what happened to him," writes Marlantes in What It Is Like to Go to War. "And once the talking begins, there's the shift that makes the burden more manageable." A little bit later, the author goes on to talk about the consequences of not talking and not being able to share these experiences. "When a soldier decides not to share his life-defining moments in war with his wife, parents, children, or community because of the accompanying guilt, shame, pain, or any other valid reason, it increases the likelihood that he will feel more alienated from the society for which he was fighting, possibly to a debilitating degree. The alcohol, drugs, and other self-medicating outlets for soldiers dealing with PTSD further isolate him from the normal comforts of a peacetime existence, work, family, and friendships, and force him even deeper into the margins of society. From here, the author goes on to explain that part of the process of the individual soldier sharing the experiences with other people, with the community around them, it also, in a way, confronts society with the responsibility they have for sending these young people off to fight wars and to kill and die and be involved in these horrible things. So he talks about this community aspect by saying, storytelling also knits a community together. It records or recreates the collective history and transforms actors and listeners alike into community witnesses, according to Tick in War and the Soul. He continues, veterans' stories need to be told in a way that transfers the oral weight of the event from the individual to the community. And in his book Achilles in Vietnam, former Veterans Affairs psychiatrist Dr. Jonathan Shea warns about what happens to both soldiers and society when those stories are never told. He says, we can never fathom the soldier's grief if we do not know the human attachment which battle nourishes and then amputates, he says. Failure to communalize grief can imprison a person in endless swinging between rage and emotional deadness as a permanent way of being in the world. And a little bit later, also, without the demythologized, demystified, authentic experiences of war being shared by those most directly involved in it, society itself will remain ignorant of the real practice of war, its costs and consequences. And then on the next page, as Tick writes in War and the Soul, our society must accept responsibility for its war making. To the returning veterans, our leaders and peoples must say, you did this in our name and because you were subject to our orders. We lift the burden of your actions from you and take it onto our shoulders. We are responsible for you, for what you did and the consequences. Stories are a way for societies to share in the burden of war. And towards the end of the book, when the author is talking about one soldier who actually recovered very well from his PTSD and his own war experiences, the author says, still being able to connect with people as well as his emotions, I realize, is possibly the key to his post-war readjustment. Certainly in my experience, PTSD has been a very alienating experience that has led to a lot of self-isolation, and it can even move from alienation to dehumanization when you get into issues talking around addiction and homelessness and other natural fallouts of PTSD. The author mentions at a few points things that are lost through trauma and by having PTSD. Here's one sentence that really struck me. When a survivor of prolonged trauma loses all sense of meaningful personal narrative, this may result in contaminated identity. He goes on to give some examples relating to the person he's talking about in this chapter, and this soldier's name is Shelton, and it says, Shelton feels his past has turned him into a hollow man, one without purpose or peace. With that loss of meaning and purpose and identity and narrative, all of that leaves no room for spiritual ideas anymore either. The prologue begins with a quote from this book, My War Gone By, I Miss It So, and the quote is, now the war is over, my war charms lie abandoned in my bedroom, leaving me with death on my shoulder and a monkey on my back. Peace seems to allow little space for belief in destiny, fate, God, or ghosts. Leading into another part later on that really personally hit home to me. One of the soldiers, in talking about himself, says, I just feel like that man died over there, and I am stuck with an existence that does not feel. It just calculates everything. The risk of going out in public, numb to any emotion, I act emotions out so people think I am somewhat fine, but I haven't felt them unless I am going 160 miles per hour on a crotch rocket. I am told, why are you not seeing your doctors? What are they going to do for me? They are not going to understand at all what I am going through, from the constant pains in my head, upper back, in hips, knees, feet, to not sleeping for days, nightmares, lack of feeling anything but anger, flashbacks, breaking down at the drop of a hat. I certainly feel like there's a real sense in which my life experiences have taken my life already. That soldier mentioned a lack of feeling anything but anger. And that back and forth between feeling nothing at all and feeling anger and not feeling anything else is certainly an aspect of it. And we actually saw that in an earlier quote where it said, failure to communalize grief can imprison a person in endless swinging between rage and emotional deadness as a permanent way of being in the world. And then this internal deadness can also lead to self-destructive behaviors. One of the staff psychiatrists in the Veterans Affairs Outpatient Clinic in Boston says, almost everyone thinks daily of suicide. It seems to sustain them as a bottom line of human freedom and dignity. Having touched that talisman every day, they continue to struggle. Having touched that talisman of human freedom and dignity, they then release it and continue to struggle until they touch it again the next day. And this self-destructiveness can manifest itself in pursuit of dangerous activities. The one soldier mentioned driving his motorcycle at ridiculous speeds. The author says here, we share a need for danger like so many in the aftermath of combat, as psychiatrist Jonathan Shea noted in Odysseus in America. Quote, prolonged combat leaves some veterans with the need to live on the edge, to pose the same question to the universe over and over again. Yes or no? Will you take me today, or will you leave me for another day? Now, there were a couple of funny moments, too. The first one, I'll read briefly here, wasn't intentionally so. The author is talking about a soldier and says, and although he was on the small side, he participated in aggressive team sports, like soccer and ice hockey. Okay, ice hockey, yes, but soccer, an aggressive sport? Hardly. But also in the midst of the darkness, there are kind of good things on the flip side of it too. And one of those things is that so much creativity seems to spring out of trauma and horrible events. The author says, but unlike yin and yang, where these opposites are not necessarily distinctions between good and evil, Jung believed the shadow was a receptacle for human darkness, but also a place of creativity. And I'll tell you, in my experience, the one thing where I feel truly fulfilled, other than in being a good dad, is through creative outlets, like making videos. But it also gave rise to a lot of horribly depressing songs that I wrote, particularly when I was younger. So the art and creativity that can arise from it can be pretty bleak as well. And in fact, one of the soldiers was writing poetry and was getting out a lot of his feelings through his poetry. And he says this, quote, I let my wife read it, his poetry, and she said it was kind of dark. I mean, yeah. But with the breakdown of one's world through trauma, through the loss of everything that I've mentioned, there's also often a real big shift in one's feeling towards fellow humans. A soldier wrote here, my whole worldview has changed to one of utter disgust of the humankind. Not the people trying to get by, but the hierarchy that rule and exploit the world. I'm extremely afraid and depressed of what will be left of this earth for my daughter. And then this question is asked late in the book. So how then does one go forward in a world marked by pain and loss and steeped in the moral inconsistency that those capable of the greatest violence win? And that's a good question. How do we proceed in a world where those who have the most money and who are willing to be the most violent are the ones who end up on top? So definitely not a cheery book overall, and not even the type of inspirational story you can sometimes get by reading about people who overcome long odds or great difficulties. It's a tough, confronting book for those of us who have experienced a lot of trauma. And hopefully for society at large as well, as I mentioned, with the responsibility that society bears toward the people that serve the society. I'd like to think that this extends to paramedics too, but maybe that's me personalizing it all. So for me, it was an okay read. It was interesting, I guess, to hear the experience of others and see how they relate to my own. And if it's something that you can handle and interests you and won't traumatize you too much, maybe you'd be interested in checking it out. In any case, I'd love to hear if you know of other stories or books about people who have overcome very crazy situations, who have experienced insane events and are able to talk about it and relate how it all affected them. And if you know anything like that, definitely recommend them below in the comments. The preceding video has been brought to you free of charge by me, Josh. The only thing I ask in return is that you could do one of the following. Give me a thumb up, push the subscribe button, or share the link to this video with somebody who you think would enjoy it. Cheers. I'm always I'm always intrigued by humans in extreme situations, which is why being in comparison to, and in his book Achilles in Vietnam, former Veterans Affairs psychiatrist, it was here, oh no. The author at a few points mentions things that are lost with the author at a few points mentions things that are lost through, oh my god. The author mentions it